Welcome to the Deep Dive. You share with us a really intriguing source document, A Brief History of Palestine, by Dr. Siravidhanawara.
Hmm.
Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack its most important insights and knowledge nuggets, digging into the specific points and perspectives it lays out just for you.
That's right. And this document offers a very particular lens on the incredibly complex history of this region.
Yep.
Understanding the historical layers and, the specific claims it presents is really essential to grasping the situation as this source describes it.
And the document itself is pretty comprehensive, isn't it? It moves through ancient history right up to recent events,
Uh-huh.
then explores thematic areas like culture, human rights, international relations, all sorts.
It truly is. It's like a journey through time and different facets of the story, all from the viewpoint presented in this text.
Okay, let's dive into what this document tells us, starting right at the beginning. How does it define Palestine and its earliest inhabitants?
So according to this source, Palestine is defined as a geographical region in Western Asia.
Okay.
And it explicitly defines it as distinct from, the present state of Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza territories.
It points out it's gone by many names over time, right?
Yes, exactly. The document mentions historical names like the Holy Land, the land of the Canaanites, land of milk and honey.
Right.
But the source draws a distinction. It notes that while these older labels refer to nationalities and concepts, the current labels refer more to territories and states.
Interesting distinction. And that brings us right to the question the source itself raises. What is Palestine and who are the Palestinians? How does this document answer that?
Well, the source states that the Palestinians are the descendants of the ancient Canaanites.
Okay, Canaanite.
Yes.
No.
And it adds that these Canaanites are also referred to as the Sea People Peliset in some hieroglyphic texts. The document is quite clear on their presence, saying it was prior to the presence of the Jews as such or as a race or ethnicity.
Yeah.
That's the specific wording used.
Wow, okay. The document then takes us way back to illustrate this point. What does it say about that really ancient history?
It describes the region being occupied by what it calls Aryan Canaanites, many, many centuries before Moses.
Aryan Canaanites.
That's the term the source uses. It paints a picture of their early life living in caves, then huts, collecting food like wheat, barley, fruits, that sort of thing.
And how does it describe the Jewish presence in this very early period? According to the source, I mean.
The document recounts that Jews seized and resided in Palestine until, battles with other nations. It notes they were scattered. At one point, it uses the phrase, scatters dispersed.
Scatters dispersed. Unusual phrasing.
It is. But it says some returned after defeats, remaining until warring against Israel. And the source includes a really striking point.
Which is?
About attempts to, and I quote, uproot the Jews from the minds of Palestine. It mentions 3 important measures and states that Pesha was a daily objective to kill the Jew.
Pesha. What does the source mean by that?
It's not entirely clear from the context provided, but it seems to be used by the source to denote, perhaps, violent acts or uprisings aimed at Jews in that period. It's a strong claim made in the document.
Wow. So right from the very start, the source lays out this narrative of deep, overlapping histories and pretty intense conflicts.
Absolutely.
Understanding these early layers as this document presents them really helps illustrate the long history of competing claims to the land that the source describes throughout. It's kind of foundational to how the document frames the ongoing situation for you.
What's particularly fascinating here, I think, is how the source immediately establishes this long, complex history. Different peoples, empires, all residing in or claiming the land, starting with its specific view on the Canaanite origins.
And speaking of empires, the document detailed a whole succession of rulers, doesn't it?
Indeed. The source tells us the region was ruled by the Assyrians first, then followed by the Babylonians.
The Babylonians.
And the document notes they forced some Jewish migration to Babylon around 700 years before the Christian era. Then after them came the Persians, Macedonians, Greeks, and finally the Romans.
The source seems to focus quite a bit on the Roman period. What happens when they take over, according to this text?
Right. So Palestine became a Roman province called Iudea, starting in 6 A.D.
Idea.
Yes. And the source describes the Roman administrative structure, mentions ethnarchs, governors, that sort of thing. It also highlights their, complex relationship with the Jewish temple elite.
How so?
It notes the Romans sort of overlooked the elite's monopolistic rule, as the source puts it, and the tax burdens they placed on people. Meanwhile, the Romans granted the elite themselves tax exemption and religious tolerance.
Yeah.
Quite a setup.
The document then brings in a really pivotal figure from this era, Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes, it does. It describes Jesus' belief that Jerusalem had become corrupted, needed reform because of injustices by temple investment. It mentions his prophecies, his growing following, which led to a confrontation with the temple elite. Then his arrest, trial before Pilate, and crucifixion.
And his followers.
The source explains that his followers viewed his resurrection as divine legitimatization. And it frames the initial church as being predominantly concerned with that resurrection creed and judging the temple establishment.
And after this, the document notes another significant change in the name of the region itself.
That's right. The source points out that after Jerusalem fell to Titus in 70 A.D., the name Judea was changed to Palestina.
Palestina.
Yes. It says this was done for political reasons and clarifies that the name Palestine itself comes from the Greek word Philistia, related to the Philistima tribes who had settled on the coast much earlier.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. The source describes the arrival of a major new force that completely reshapes the region.
Ah, you must mean the Islamic conquest in the 7th century A.D.
Exactly. Yeah.
Led by Caliph Omar ibn Khattab. The source says they defeated the Byzantines and entered Jerusalem peacefully.
Peacefully.
That's what the source states. It highlights this as the second time, after the time of David, that Arabs were able to control this holy city.
And this conquest ushers in new Islamic dynasties ruling the region, right?
Yes. The Umayyad dynasty rose to power, based in Damascus.
Damascus, okay.
The source mentions that Greeks, who previously held significant positions, lost government posts. These were then taken over by local Syrian Christian and Samaritan groups.
But it wasn't smooth sailing for them?
No, the source notes that popular hostility made the position of these groups troublesome. And Christians seem to have suffered some prejudice in this early phase, according to the text.
And the source details the shift then, from the Umayyads to the Abbasids.
It does. The Umayyad dynasty was overthrown by the Abbasids and their supporters in 750 A.D.
Why the change, according to this source?
The source attributes it to discontent over Umayyad favoritism towards the Quraysh tribe and how they treated non-Arab Muslims, the Mawali, as sort of inferior. Under rulers like Harun al-Rashid, the source describes a flourishing of knowledge and arts, but it also notes that Abbasid power later disintegrated because of uprisings.
The document also includes a specific section on cultural developments during this time. What does it highlight?
Well, it describes how Arabs came into active contact with other nations under the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs, borrowing terms for sciences and arts.
Borrowing terms.
Yes. And a key detail the source points out is the development of Arabic prosody, the metric for poetry. It explicitly states this was borrowed, not native growth. It says it was taken from the Dakni Arzuman people.
That's very specific.
It is.
Yeah.
And the source notes that mastering this metric was considered an essential part of a scholar's education back then. It highlights this focus on external influences on Arab culture, which is an interesting point from this particular document.
This history, as told by the source, it just seems marked by continuous waves of conquest and conflict. What does the source say about the Crusades?
Right, the Crusades. The source describes them as a series of religious wars, running from the late 11th to late 13th centuries. Primarily aimed, it says, at recapturing the Holy Land from Muslim rule.
And the First Crusade specifically.
It details the First Crusade, initiated in 1095 by Pope Urban II's call. It talks about the armies marching through the Byzantine Empire, arriving in the Levant between 1096 and 1099, and the taking of Jerusalem in 1099 after about a month-long siege. This then led to the establishment of Crusader states in the region.
Did the source discuss later Crusades as well?
Yes, it mentions later Crusades throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. It specifically notes the Fourth Crusade.
The one that sacked Constantinople.
Exactly, in 1204.
Yeah.
Leading to, as the source puts it, a catastrophic decline in Byzantine power. It also notes the Muslim efforts in the late 12th century to kind of unify and build anti-Crusader alliances.
And what about the impact of all this warfare on the people actually living there? Does the source touch on that?
Briefly. The document notes that the impact of war on local populations is an under-researched topic. Yeah. It specifically calls this out regarding the 1948 war-era demographics and social fabric, suggesting the lasting impact of such conflicts isn't fully understood, at least from the perspective available for this source.
Moving forward again, the source then describes another long period of rule, the Ottoman Empire.
Right. Palestine, according to the source, entered the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century after Sultan Selim's conquest.
16th century?
Yeah. It became a department, or a vilayet, and remained under the Sultan's rule for 4 centuries, 400 years.
Wow. How did the Ottomans administer the region during this long period? What does the source say?
The source says the Ottomans used a system of provinces and sub-provinces, and this system apparently remained in place for hundreds of years, right up until the end of World War I.
And the source notes a period of reforms under the Ottomans in the later years.
It does. From the mid-19th century, the source says the Ottoman Empire began implementing political, administrative, economic, and social reforms. Well, it notes that this period gave the term Palestine more of a political connotation, and it introduced changes like granting citizens of different religious communities the right to vote, although the source seems to kind of question how secure that right was in practice.
It sounds like this was also a time of rising political thought and movement.
Absolutely. The source mentions general unrest and popular crises across Ottoman territories in the 1880s and 1890s.
Okay.
Palestinian cities, it says, became meeting places for nationalists advocating for new political systems. And this trend apparently intensified after the 1908 Young Turks Revolution.
The source then highlights a major turning point after World War I, the beginning of the British Mandate.
That's right. That's when Britain gained control after defeating the Turkish army in 1917. The source frames this within the context of the Treaty of Sèvres and the League of Nations mandate system.
And a really key document in this period, according to the source, is the Balfour Declaration.
Ah, yes. The source describes the Balfour Declaration of 1917 as declaring Palestine a homeland for the Jewish people. It provides some background, mentioning Zionism as a powerful global movement, key figures like Chaim Weizmann, Lord Walter Rothschild. And the source lists what it calls the stated reasons for British support from the Zionist perspective presented. Things like addressing pauperization, creating a barrier for the Suez Canal, and something called a McKinley gift to supposedly obliterate certain refugee groups. It's quite specific language in the source.
A McKinley gift. And the document details how this declaration was implemented under the British Mandate itself.
Yes. The British Mandate for Palestine was formally confirmed in 1923 by the League of Nations.
Okay.
The source says Britain was given care over Palestine to supervise its administration until independence, but with the specific responsibilities of establishing a national home for the Jewish people and implementing the Balfour Declaration.
And the Palestinians living there.
That's a crucial point the source makes. It says the fate of the native population was not spelled out in the mandate's core responsibilities.
Wow. And how does the source describe the reality of British rule from, say, 1920 to 1948?
Well, following the 1929 Palestinian uprising, the source states the land remained under British colonial rule. It says that during this period, the Balfour Declaration was fully implemented.
And the result?
Significant increase in the Jewish population, according to the source, from about 10% to 30%. And a considerable rise in their land possession percentage. The source notes that while limited political reforms were introduced, they were sort of short-lived and localized. And importantly, a state of emergency law was continuously applied.
Right. The source also discusses a parallel movement happening during this time, Arab nationalism.
It does. It explains Arab nationalism as a movement not limited just to Muslims or a single region. It involved, the source says, various Christian sects, Muslims, and Jews.
Aiming for what?
The goal, as the source puts it, was to Arabize their Ottoman identity and elevate the status of Arab people globally.
And where does Palestinian nationalism fit into this, according to the source? Is it the same thing?
Not exactly. The source views Palestinian nationalism as emerging later in the late 19th century, and primarily as a response to Zionist encroachment.
So a reaction.
That's how this source frames it. It states that the fight against Zionism only became a major focus of Arab nationalism after the failure to create an independent Arab state centered in Damascus.
Okay.
And the source makes an interesting point here, saying the Palestinian nationalist movement was, quote, on a personal level, more than any other Arab country.
On a personal level. All these historical threads, as presented by the source, they seem to build towards a really pivotal moment in 1948.
Absolutely. The source describes the unilateral declaration of the State of Israel by David Ben-Gurion on May 14th, 1948.
Ben-Gurion.
Yes, head of the Jewish Agency. He announced the new state would take over the agency's role.
And how did this moment play out, the reception?
According to the source, well, for Zionists globally, it was met with amazement, joy, excitement, seen as this historic opportunity.
But for others?
Ben-Gurion, the source says, was surprised that the Arabs, both inside and outside Palestine, reacted with thunder and fury. That's the phrase used.
Thunder and fury.
Yes. The Arab states, it notes, referred the matter to the UN Security Council, rejected the UN partition plan, and called for intervention by Arab armies.
Which leads directly into the 1948 war.
Exactly. The source describes the 1948 Arab-Israeli war as Arab neighbors opposing the declaration, with attacks on Jewish settlements. It notes that Arab military maneuvers sparked fears of invasion.
How did the fighting go, according to the source?
On the ground, the source points out an initial lack of coordination among Arab armies. It states the IDF, the Israeli forces, were horribly outnumbered and outgunned, but proved resourceful and resilient, defending their homes. According to the source, Israel consolidated its hold on the land over about a year.
A major consequence described by the source is Palestinian displacement, the Nakba.
Yes, the source terms this displacement, the Nakba, as mass immigration and ethnic cleansing, beginning from November 1947.
Ethnic cleansing, strong words.
Very strong words used in the document. It describes attacks on vulnerable and isolated Arab areas, leading to many towns and villages being abandoned or depopulated.
And specific actions.
The source mentions extensive plans for de-Arabization by the Yishuv establishment, that's the pre-state Jewish community leadership. And it states villages were subjected to deballing.
Deballing. What does that mean in this context?
Again, it's unusual terminology in the source. It seems to be used here to describe the systematic removal or emptying of populations from villages. The source says the biggest cities became ghost towns, resulting in a widespread refugee crisis.
The source offers a perspective on how the Palestinian issue is understood both regionally and internationally, doesn't it?
It does. It describes the Palestinian issue as a core Arab issue, seen as reflecting the rise of the Arab nations' interaction with Zionism, which the source views as a product of integration between the West and Zionism.
So an Arab issue.
Yes, Palestinian identity is described as Arab, the homeland part of the Arab region. However, the source also calls it an international cause.
That's so.
It notes it was raised on the international arena under European colonialism, and that the world is concerned with finding a just solution. So both Arab and international, according to this text.
It seems to highlight a contradiction, though.
It does. The source highlights what it sees as the strangest contradictions in Arab awareness, where the issue is considered an Arab question while simultaneously, quote, ignoring the heart of the issue, which is the displacement of the overwhelming majority. This is a critical view presented by the document itself.
And the source even distinguishes between different groups of displaced Palestinians based on when they were displaced.
Yes, exactly. He discusses the case of return for 1948 Palestinians. Their focus, the source says, is on seeking a stronger presence in occupied land and land ownership.
And the source's assessment of that.
It describes this as potentially the fastest case for ownership, but also the weakest in terms of possibility. It contrasts this with the displaced of 1967.
The Six-Day War.
Right. Who were almost 5 times the number, according to the source, and deemed incapable of returning due to the passage of time's effect on geography. The source says they are strongest in numbers and documentation, but slowest in implementation of return.
This is, well, it's a lot to take in. And connecting these historical events and their differing impacts back to you, the listener, the source here lays out a history framed by displacement, by competing narratives about who belongs, who was forced to leave.
Wow.
Understanding the socioeconomic conditions and the differing experiences of those displaced in 48 versus 67, as described in this source, really helps illustrate the complex layers of the refugee crisis that, according to the source, are still profoundly present today. It gives you a specific historical perspective to consider based purely on this document.
It certainly does. The source provides a very particular narrative for you to analyze, definitely.
As the source moves into the later 20th century, it describes the rise of Palestinian organization.
Right. That's the formation of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, in 1964.
Established by...
The source says it was established under the auspices of the Arab League, and its purpose was organizing and creating a unified Palestinian nation.
How did the PLO's approach evolve over time? Based on this document, did it stay the same?
No, not at all. Initially, the source says its activities were more focused on just publicizing the cause internationally, getting the word out.
Okay.
But then a new generation came to the fore, and the PLO adopted a harder line. It emphasized active armed struggle against Israel, particularly after Yasser Arafat took command in 1969.
Arafat.
Yes. The source then analyzes what it calls the PLO's changing functionality style. It's an interesting phrase.
Functionality style, how does it break that down?
It describes a transformation from a revolutionary ideology based on Marxism-Leninism to mostly pragmatic goals, then shifting focus to economic development and educational efforts for refugees in the diaspora, and finally, towards Arab nation-state directed diplomacy.
Quite a journey.
It is. The source highlights the PLO's role as a non-state agent organization that significantly influenced the international scene.
The source also mentions periods of widespread popular resistance on the ground, the intifadas.
Yes, it describes the intifadas, understood as popular uprisings. The first intifada, it says, started in December 1987 in Jabalia refugee camp.
Triggered,
the source says, by a traffic accident involving an Israeli driver. The document details the tactics used: burning tires on roads, throwing stones at vehicles and soldiers, marching with flags, chanting slogans, classic images. It mentions a general strike in March 1988 and notes that the youth actions were often not coordinated with existing groups. This led to smaller, localized leaders and something called a youth coalition emerging.
Interesting dynamic. And following this period of uprising, the source describes a phase associated with, well, hope for peace, maybe.
That would be the Oslo Accords, signed between 1993 and 1995.
The famous handshake.
Exactly. The source says these were initiated after that handshake and were agreements between Israel and the PLO outlining principles for negotiation towards a Palestinian Authority.
And practical steps.
Joint committees, the source notes, were set up to oversee policy, negotiate, build Palestinian institutions, all that groundwork.
What did the negotiation process outlined in the source actually entail? What was agreed?
Well, the source says the agreement was to establish a Palestinian self-government authority in areas resided in 1967. This led to the withdrawal of Israeli military forces from Jericho in 1994.
Jericho first.
Yes, and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority with a parliamentary system.
But the source seems quite critical of Oslo's impact, doesn't it?
It is, yes. It calls it a concerning scenario. It states there was no relevant progress on any of the major final status issues: borders, refugees, Jerusalem.
Why not, according to the source?
It points to what it calls the inherent asymmetry of the conflict.
Asymmetry.
Yeah. The source highlights the letters of mutual recognition as an example. Arafat committed the PLO to recognizing Israel and renouncing terrorism. But Rabin's letter, the source notes, omitted any reference to UN resolutions, statehood, or even future negotiations on final status.
That's a significant omission, if true.
According to the source, yes. It says the Oslo process eventually culminated in the Camp David summit in 2000.
Camp David 2000.
Right. It notes the Barak's offer there, which apparently divided territories into cantons and limited Jerusalem's autonomy, was rejected by both Palestinian negotiators and public opinion.
And the refugee issue.
Crucially, the source points out the lack of any mention of the refugee issue in those proposals, and the source's conclusion on Oslo. It states that since Oslo, quote, all remained largely unchanged, and persisting floods of Jewish settlers continued to occupy Palestinian territories.
So a pretty negative assessment from this document, bringing us closer to the present day. What does the source say about the current political landscape? How does it frame things now?
The source places the Palestinian situation in the broader context of the Arab Spring revolutions in 2011.
The Arab Spring connection.
Yes, noting similar demands for economic well-being and political freedoms across the region. It states that the whole region will never be the same again.
A big claim.
It is. And it highlights the reassessment of fundamental notions like the Arab world, Arab societies, and identities based on language, religion, ethnicity, history, all being re-examined.
And specifically regarding Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank.
The source focuses on Gaza and the West Bank, describing them as the two territories established with the Declaration of the State of Palestine, based on 1967 borders. It mentions Israel's stated desire for demilitarization and settlement control, and the interim self-government arrangements agreed back in 1993, where Israel handled security and the PA civil affairs, which were further formalized by Oslo.
It also talks about the separation of Gaza, right?
It does. It details the administrative separation of Gaza from Israel since 1973, initially under Egyptian military rule, with a weak local government needing Israeli approval. The source notes how the 1980s uprising changed this policy.
And the internal Palestinian division, Hamas and Fatah.
Yes, it describes the significant political division within the Palestinian territories after the 2006 Hamas election victory. President Abbas suspending parliament, the internal struggle, culminating in what the source terms the June 2007 bloody coup, where Hamas expelled Fatah officials from institutions in Gaza.
Bloody coup, another strong term from the source. What about international relations? How does the source see Palestine's place in the world?
Well, it describes the early challenge for the PLO in promoting Palestinian interests in a volatile environment. Often, the source says, those interests were not the top priority on international or even Arab agendas.
Right.
There was concern about how the Arab-Israeli conflict would unfold and whether Palestinian interests would remain central. The force conveys a perception that relations between the U.S. and certain Eastern Arab states were subservient to Israeli interests,
Leading to fears about.
leading to a fear that negotiations might actually be harmful to Palestinian interests, particularly regarding the status of the West Bank and Gaza. Rising Islamic fundamentalism is also mentioned as a concern in the source.
And the core threat, according to the document.
The source explicitly states that the most important source of worry was the threat to existence posed by Israel, whose oppressive measures. The source's words included sabotaging economies and overt military incursions. This highlights the source's view on the primary perceived threat.
It's clear how these recent developments and ongoing challenges, as presented in the source, offer insight into the complexities of the situation you are researching. The source's description of the internal divisions, its critique of the Oslo process's outcome, its perspective on external pressures and international relations, it really illuminates the multi-layered political landscape, according to this document.
It provides a very specific interpretation of these recent events and dynamics, yes. It's one perspective laid out in detail.
The source also dedicates significant sections to exploring specific dimensions beyond just the political history. It starts with culture. What does it say there?
The source presents Palestinian cultural heritage as having deep diversity and a long history, but existing in what it calls a contradictory situation.
Contradictory how?
Difficult politics versus accepting the benefits of globalization. It notes that some cultural sites are inaccessible despite PLO treaties, but also points to rising sensitivity and development in areas like museums, archives, restoration projects.
It categorizes heritage too, doesn't it?
Yes, it offers a detailed categorization of built cultural heritage, distinguishing between sites whose significance comes from exclusion versus inclusion. It's quite theoretical. The source emphasizes the idea of a constructed historic text and the organic nature of the total text of heritage, suggesting, that history is constantly being interpreted and built upon.
What does the source tell us about Palestinian literature and arts?
It says they draw on external influences while maintaining a unique identity, reflecting the region's historical and cultural richness. The artistic scene, the source says, has awakened in recent years.
Awakened?
Yeah, with new movements appearing alongside traditional ones. The source views literature and arts as a kind of microcosm of Palestinian existence, creativity, and suffering.
Microcosm.
Including poetry, oral literature, music, painting, and so on. It highlights dimensions of plurality, interconnection, integration within these arts, even though they may have emerged independently.
And traditions and customs, beyond the high arts.
The source describes traditions and customs, noting they predate Islam. Some survived, others changed, some new ones emerged.
Examples.
Food and drinks, local arts like literature, music, dancing, singing, festivals, commemorations. It emphasizes their grave importance for belonging and identity.
But there's a downside mentioned.
Yes, it touches on how they can ironically hurt makers. Becoming cultural shrapnel, that's the source's term that sometimes leads to strictness, impatience, or even what the source describes as the extreme absurdity of rigid pride, a very nuanced point.
Cultural shrapnel. The source also prominently addresses human rights issues in the region.
It does. It describes the core longing for independence and statehood, the call for return to pre-1967 borders, and Palestinian self-determination.
But notes differing views.
Yes. The source notes differing views on what Palestine even means, ranging from the occupied territories under Arab rule to, in some views presented, the annihilation of Israel. It discusses how the cause is debated internationally through lenses of religious fervor, realpolitik, external onlookers.
And for Palestinians themselves?
For Palestinians, the source states, these conflicting claims contribute to a fragmentation of identity and the perceived disappearances of Palestine itself.
What about the occupation and settlements specifically? How does the source discuss those?
It describes what it calls the increasingly oppressive measures used to defend Israeli claims, and how mass uprisings are met with the iron fist, both phrases from the source.
Does it give examples?
It details events from 1948, like the siege at Deir Yassin, which the source says appalled an outside world, with news of atrocities circulated which inflamed the Arab public with anger and fear, leading to refugees pouring out.
And the de-Arabization plans.
Yes, it mentions extensive plans for de-Arabization by the Yishuv establishment again, and notes the impact of what it calls the clearance segment on belief in steadfastness, with the area falling under military oppression.
And settlement building later on.
The source notes that the peak of settlement establishment inside the 1967 borders occurred in the 1970s, with efforts, it says, to pressure residents and enforce relocating, and investments made despite limited success in establishing all planned settlements.
The source also examines this situation through the lens of international law. What's its take?
Well, it describes the end of wartime after the UN partition proposal, with Jewish forces declaring statehood, winning the war, and the resulting refugee crisis.
And refugee return under law.
The source notes the difficulty of return for refugees due to what it calls alleged Israeli property laws, and it states that understanding the law requires context, suggesting it's not straightforward.
It uses some strong language about current activities, too.
It does. It mentions ongoing Israeli activity to erase Palestinian existence, which the source describes as startling, with shocking reverberations in Western conscience. It also notes broad-based international sympathy for Palestine and Palestinians.
Does it give specific examples of international law efforts?
Yes, things like Mahmoud Abbas's appeal to the UN for non-member state status. The source says it received worldwide backing but was foiled by U.S. threats.
Okay.
It notes foiled PLO attempts for the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to label settlements as war crimes. And it mentions few recent court cases actually interpreting or enforcing international principles.
But Palestinians use these avenues.
The source points out that Palestinian organizations and activists strategically exploit these legal avenues politically. It cites BDS initiatives, boycott, divestment, sanctions as an example.
And post-Oslo.
The source highlights Palestinian pursuit of negotiations based on international law after Oslo, leading to statehood proclamations, membership in over 50 international organizations, and ICC affiliation. It shares the source's perspective that states have the primary responsibility for upholding international law. And it includes the source's point about needing to understand Israeli self-identification and existential fears, suggesting these potentially conditioned responses to threats or claims of genocidal intent, a complex psychological point from the source.
Finally, the source discusses the role of international organizations, particularly the UN.
Yes, it describes their crucial role in addressing the Palestinian question since 1945, promoting rights and identity. It mentions the UN's 1947 partition plan,
which proposed
granting statehood to both Jewish and Arab entities, and subsequent resolutions like GA 181-194 dealing with partition and refugees.
But the source is critical of the UN's role.
Highly critical, yes.
Yeah.
It states, the problem rested fractally and ubiquitously in the UN. It calls the partitioning efforts compromise independence and territorial integrity in unjust and unfeasible ways. It even views the UN presence itself as a straitjacket. The source poses pointed questions, asking whether anything left in Palestine is not subject to libel, and whether citizens still see Palestinians in a fabled light, while, as the source dramatically puts it, Gaza burns and refugee children die.
So, a loss of faith in the UN from this perspective.
That's the source's perspective, that the UN is in a cautionary position of not preserving the peace created by the partitioning, citing what it sees as preliminary hostilities, meddling, weapons flow. The source states that despite efforts, the UN will never recover the unlimited admiration it had in the hearts of Palestinians before the partition, viewing its actions as contradicting their own struggle.
What about NGOs, non-governmental organizations?
The source discusses their contributions too, describing them as having emerged due to the occupation and what it calls de-development.
Doing what?
Providing services or acting as observers, denouncing rights violations. While the bulk are concerned with the conflict and politics, the source notes some emerged opportunistically or work on unrelated themes.
And their actions.
The source notes the increase in poverty and highlights NGOs presenting evidence to the International Court of Justice against the security barrier, and engaging in other adversarial actions like demonstrations, strikes, petitions targeting the UN and EU. It also mentions a shift in how Fatah intellectuals viewed civil society after Hamas won elections in 2006.
It's clear how these thematic areas, culture, human rights, international involvement, intersect with the historical timeline presented earlier in the document.
Definitely.
The source shows how culture, despite difficulties, endures. It illustrates how the human rights issues discussed often stem directly from the historical events and policies it describes, and it offers a very critical perspective on how international involvement, or the source's view on its shortcomings, has impacted the situation. This synthesis is crucial for you to make sense of the multiple interconnected dimensions at play in the document.
It really does connect the historical narrative to the lived experience and the complex web of actors involved, all through the specific lens of this source. It's quite a tapestry it weaves.
After covering this deep history and the current dimensions, the source turns its gaze towards the future. What does it say? Hopeful, bleak.
It describes the future as uncertain and complex, stating it hinges significantly on the political will of both Israelis and Palestinians and the involvement of regional and global players. No easy answers here.
And the two-state solution? Still viable, according to this source.
Well, the source explains the two-state solution as the preferred outcome in the peace process, the basis for accord since 1993. But it heavily questions its viability now.
Okay.
It notes its basis is the 1947 UN resolution proposing Jewish and Arab states, which it says was accepted by Jews but rejected by Arabs, leading to the 47-48 war.
And the current reality.
The source states that today, Israel occupies approximately 78% of the former British Mandate territory. And according to its figures, more than 75% of Palestinians live in exile.
Wow, 75% in exile.
That's the figure in the source. Despite this, it notes the UN resolution remains the basis of international consensus. It mentions the PLO's 1988 declaration accepting Resolution 242 as a basis for a two-state solution and recognizing Israel's right to exist.
But the source sees problems.
Big problems. It strongly highlights its view that events over the last 2 decades have cast a significant shadow on the two-state solution's credibility.
Why?
It describes the state-building effort after Oslo as marred by disagreements and increasingly seen as an orchestrated illusion. A political process, the source argues, serving the interests of one side, namely Israel, primarily due to the surge in settlement construction during this period.
And recent events.
The source states that the 2014 war on Gaza further muted state-building rhetoric. Statehood came to be viewed as irrelevant, it says, with the UN nearly unattended.
So, if not two states, what options does the source see?
This is stark. Regarding current options, the source suggests they share a common negation, namely a viable Palestinian state.
A common negation.
Yes. It views the two-state solution, as currently implemented, as implying continued occupation and historic, irreversible loss. But alternative paradigms, like a binational or one-state solution,
Yes.
the source suggests they entail convergence toward an Israeli-dominated political regime, presupposing what it sees as a fundamentally one-sided approach, not optimistic.
What about the wider region, regional stability?
The source touches upon that briefly, describing the complex, deeply rooted interests of Middle East actors, regime stability, fears of the West or socialism, globalization, terrorism roots. It suggests stability is only a precondition for peace if interpreted in terms of options, norms, strategies, which the source argues are often neglected. It points out the region's potential to widen conflict globally and factors necessitating restraint on expectations.
And it mentions dichotomies.
Yes, systemic dichotomies, a deep existential gulf in values and expectations, undue weight given to Oslo's values, and the perceived indifference of the U.S. and Western allies post-Gulf War, presiding over a decay of their power and prestige related to peace proposals. A rather bleak regional picture from this source.
We've covered such a vast amount of history and thematic ground here, haven't we? Drawing only from the specific document you shared with us.
We really have.
From the source's account of ancient origins and the successive empires, to the British Mandate, the formation of Israel, displacement, resistance, peace attempts, the complex present day. It's a dense and layered history as presented by this source.
Indeed. The source walks us through centuries of claims, conflicts, shifting powers, emphasizing the long, often difficult history of the region from its particular viewpoint.
The source ends with a reflection on disturbances going way back to the 19th century, doesn't it? Mentioning conflicts over holy places, the covetousness of land.
That's right.
It even specifically references disputes like those involving the Greek convent in Bethlehem as examples of these ongoing conflicts over holy sites and territory right up to the end of the document.
Yes, and according to this document, it leaves us with a powerful picture of how these historical forces, these competing claims, external influences, how they've all shaped the present landscape and continue to influence the future prospects as seen through this lens.
So, reflecting on this deep dive into your source, what does this all mean for you? This document presents a history of continuous change, offering multiple narratives of origin and belonging, and highlighting ongoing challenges for the people connected to this land. It shows how events and perspectives laid out centuries ago, like the specific origins and conflicts, the service details right from the beginning, can still profoundly resonate and shape the dynamics today, according to this text.
It really does. And it raises, I think, an important question for you to consider. Considering the deep, multi-layered history described in this specific document, with its accounts of successive peoples, empires, conflicts, differing claims to the land, and given the source's quite critical view on the challenges facing modern peace efforts, what new perspectives does this specific history, as presented only in your source, offer you as you think about the future prospects for the region?
A lot to think about, indeed. Thank you for sharing the source with us and letting us take this deep dive together into its unique perspectives.
Thank you.
We hope this has provided you with valuable insights and a clearer understanding of the points and the historical narrative laid out in this specific document.
Hope it's been useful.
Until the next deep dive.